Today is October 30th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you've been paying attention to the news recently from the Middle East, you'll know that there's quite a bit of action developing between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And there's lots of controversial stuff going on, but in America, the response has been pretty interesting. Recently, there have been a number of protests on college campuses where Muslim students or students of the Middle East who are studying on American campuses have protested against what appears to be indiscriminate killing among the people of Gaza. And so on these college campuses, there have been these protests where pro-Palestinian students have gathered to express their concern for the rights of Palestinians. And conservatives in America have responded somewhat in shock by complaining that this is what our college campuses have become. They say this is what the modern college has become. Look at this. It's like a breeding ground or a training ground for terrorists in America. And these accusations are made against the best colleges and universities in America. Most influentially, I think, was the protest on the Harvard campus, a pro-Palestinian protest by two different groups. One was an undergraduate group, another was a graduate group, where they simply gathered on the Harvard campus and said, hey, what about these women and children who are being killed here? Don't we think something should be done to temper this response? And conservative social media, conservative media went crazy with all of this criticism and talk about elite universities in America and how they're basically producing anti-American terrorists. Now, what actually happened, I can speak for the Harvard campus. What happened at Harvard was that a group of anywhere from 200 to some say 1,000, but I actually counted the protesters in one photo, and there were 250. But around 250 people, we don't even know if they were students, gathered on the Harvard campus and made a case for Palestinian safety, pro-Palestinian protests. So 250 people from two student organizations, or organized by two student organizations. The president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay, came out and condemned the violent actions of Hamas. It was very clear that what happened in Israel, the terrorist attacks that happened in Israel, were condemned by the leadership at Harvard University. But there was this protest of 250 students. Now, there are 22,000 students at Harvard University. There were 250, I counted, at a protest. You can do the math. 250 divided by 22,000. I'll do it real quick. 250 divided by 22,000, that's 1%. So 1% of the student population, if they're even students, 1% participated in this protest. So the reality of what happened is that 99% of the Harvard community did not support the protest, and the president of Harvard University condemned the terrorist attacks of Hamas. Yet, despite this complete lack of support for this protest and public condemnation by the leadership of the university, the conservative media, nevertheless, came up with the conclusion that elite universities are turning American kids into supporters of terrorist organizations. This is how crazy and irrational conservative America has become. And I want to talk about this a little bit. I want to talk about this common criticism among conservatives, especially Christians, this common criticism of what are called elite universities. And by this, we're usually referring to the Ivy League schools, schools like Stanford, and then public universities that are considered top universities like Cal Berkeley and other state universities. These are referred to as the elite universities. If you go to U.S. News and World, I forget what the name of it is. U.S. News and World Report, sorry. And look at their rankings of the top colleges and universities in America. Those are considered the elite universities. They're criticized as being these liberal breeding grounds. And so Christian students don't go there. Christian parents don't want their children to go to those schools. Christian parents and Christian school teachers, Christian politicians, Christian pastors criticize and mock these schools, even though they're ranked by numerous ranking polls and publications. They're ranked as the best universities in America, most selective, most competitive, most rigorous, and so on. They're criticized as being these useless, stupid breeding ground for anti-Christian, pro-terrorist worldviews. And this is all false. This is all false. I know this because I was a Christian student who attended a strong state university, Rutgers University, and I know that it's not true that Rutgers University taught me to be an anti-Christian, pro-communist liberal. That's not true. And currently I'm studying at Harvard, and nothing could be further from the truth. As I said, 99% of the student body didn't support the protest. And the university president condemned the violence that was committed by Hamas. So I don't understand what conservatives and Christian families are talking about. What they say about America's best universities is simply not true. But I'd like to talk about why they do this. Why do they do this? Why are Christians, of all people, spreading false information about America's best colleges and universities? And so you know, there are Christians at these schools, and they do very well. Many of the professors are Christians. For example, at Princeton, Robert George is one of the leading professors there, faithful, Catholic, conservative. The message is just false about these schools. But I think there's a reason why this has become popular, and I'd like to talk about it. Conservatives have a very difficult time living in modern America, or just in America in general. They have a very hard time. They have a very hard time with the idea of freedom. They have a hard time with freedom of speech. They have a hard time with freedom of the press. They have a hard time with freedom of religion. They have a very difficult time with freedom because their worldview, their mentality, their intellectual ability, their message, their teaching, their practice, and so on, is very weak, and freedom threatens their worldview. Freedom threatens the things they say. Freedom threatens the things they tell their children. Freedom threatens the things they tell themselves. I'll give you an example to illustrate what I mean. Let's say it's Christmas time and we've got a bunch of little kids, 4 years old, 5 years old. We want to have fun for the holidays, so we teach our children about Santa Claus. And we tell them the traditional stories about Santa Claus, about how he mounts his reindeers and loads his sleigh with toys and then travels through the world and on Christmas Eve delivers toys to all the good boys and girls. And we have this nice traditional fairy tale of Santa Claus, and children enjoy it, and there's all kinds of movies and stories and celebrations and decorations that we can enjoy with our kids. And we enjoy telling our kids about Santa Claus. Well, that works when the children are young and they really don't think much about it and they enjoy the thought of it, and it's just all positive to them because Santa brings toys. You know, who's going to object? Santa brings toys, and all we've got to do is we've got to be good, and we've got to leave some milk and cookies for Santa and maybe a carrot for his reindeer. It's fun, and the end result is desirable. But then we start criticizing the story as the kids get older. The kids start questioning it. Other relatives start saying how stupid it is. Some Christians argue that they rejected its false teaching because they've got to be miserable. And, eventually the kids just abandon talk about Santa Claus and all this stuff until they have kids of their own and they want to give their children the same fun they had when they were little. It's just fun. But there are some people who oppose it, say that it's evil, say that it takes away from focusing on Christ and the holidays and all this. And so this nice, cute story, this nice, cute celebration, this nice, happy tradition has to be abandoned because it gets challenged by these outside sources. And it can be annoying to go through something like that. It's something happy, something we like, something we enjoy with our children. Why do people have to question it? Why do people have to ruin it? Why do people have to say all kinds of ridiculous things like it's impossible for Santa to travel around the world, it's impossible for reindeers to fly, and all this stuff? But that's what happens. And just like with the Santa Claus story, some parents, some families present religion in the same way to their children. They present a traditional view of the Christian religion, an overly simplified, childish, happy, family-friendly version of Christianity that they enjoy. It's pleasant. The children enjoy it. You can have fun Bible stories. You can have fun songs to sing. You can watch Veggie Tales. You can learn about saints, short stories about the lives of the saints. You can decorate the house. You can get dressed up and go to church. And you can control the narrative. You can control the message, control this image of Christianity and make it beautiful and happy and fun and simple for the children. And everything seems to be going well. But it's not the real message of Christianity. It's not the real message. It's a romanticized, overly simplified, cleaned up version of Christianity that's meant for the nursery, meant for children. But at some point, the children are going to have to learn that there's more to Christianity than this cute little Veggie Tales religion that they learn when they're children. It gets uglier. It gets more complicated. It gets confusing. The things that they were taught as children get challenged and contradicted. And parents hate that because they feel like everything was good as it was. Why can't you just leave us alone? Why can't the children just be left alone with this simple worldview, with this simple message? And part of the reason is because it's not true. It's simply not true. The faith is more complicated, the religion is more complicated, church life is more complicated. And at some point, you've got to interact with the ugly side of Christianity, the challenging side of Christianity, the side that Jesus warned us about throughout his whole ministry in the Gospels. Christianity cannot be kept as a Santa Claus-like story or tradition designed to entertain children. At some point, the real message has to be engaged with. The real problem of human sin and all of the complexity of the world has to be engaged with. And what happens is in the family, it goes from being a happy, simple Christian family to a family where the stories are questioned, the teachings are contradicted, the celebrations are abandoned, and the parents see this as the children abandoning their religion, abandoning Christianity. And so the accusations against the children change from our children grew up and they chose not to continue with the simple little traditions that we taught them as children into an accusation that our children have abandoned the faith. Our children have left the truth. And these accusations are not true. These accusations are not true. The overly simplified, romanticized Christian worldview that was taught to the children was in fact not true. That was not the Christian faith. And so the children are forced to deal with the ugliness of reality when they get older and start to come under the influence of different people, read different things, see, hear different things, and so on. And the parents, as I said, falsely accuse the children of abandoning the faith or falling away from the faith, and that's not true. What's happening is the children are simply leaving that overly simplified, romanticized, fake version of Christianity. And they've got to deal with the real world. And frankly, they're not prepared for it because they were taught a worldview and a religion that doesn't actually solve the problems of the real world. Now, if these kids go away to college, and if in God's providence they happen to go to an excellent college, a selective college, they're going to find their worldview challenged much more violently, much more constantly, than they will if they choose to go to a college that more or less retains and supports the worldview that was taught by the parents when the children were young. Many Catholic parents try to send their kids to colleges that will continue to shelter them, continue to block out reality, and keep their children in a little snow globe of this overly simplified, romanticized Christianity. And they think that if they can just keep all the bad guys out, keep all the bad stories out, keep all the bad books out, the children will stay in the faith. And this is very interesting because it almost suggests that they believe the children are good intrinsically and will remain good as long as they're not corrupted by outside influences. And that's heresy. That's false teaching. It seems like they're denying original sin. It seems like they're denying the reality that sin comes out from us. It doesn't come into us. It comes from us. And the soul is capable of standing in the presence of evil, and if that soul is rightly disposed and is under the influence of God's grace, that soul can be holy even in the presence of evil. That's the power of true Christian life. And the truth of the Christian faith is also able to overcome all objections. So really, for a true Christian, there's nothing that can overcome true faith. Nothing. And so when it appears that there's a loss of faith, there isn't necessarily a loss of faith. It could simply be a loss of that original ignorance and naivety of childhood. And the child is forced to now engage with the real world that was hid from him, and he needs to start all over again. But by the grace of God, he'll learn about the world truly, and then he'll learn about the Christian faith truly, and find in the Christian faith the solution for the darkness he sees in the world. That more complicated religion of his adulthood is what can save him. That overly simplified, romanticized religion of his childhood will not save him. Now, what happens at the elite universities, in the good colleges, is that students are forced to interact with very smart and, even more importantly, very diligent professors and students. They're forced to deal with people who will catch false statements. They're forced to deal with people who will catch inconclusive arguments. They're forced to deal with people who are going to ask for evidence for things that are asserted. And they're not going to be allowed to just say whatever they like. They're not going to be allowed to just make up their own story to support their own views. They're going to face questioning and opposition that comes with evidence and makes demands for evidence. And so anything that's fake in their religion is going to be burned up by the heat of this examination. And that's what happens to kids who come from sheltered Christian families, who are taught this overly simplified, romanticized religion. They get into the presence of smart, courageous people who aren't afraid to ask questions, and they melt. They melt. Now, if the grace of faith is within them, they will rebuild. They won't fall. They won't collapse. They'll suffer a great deal. They'll be humbled painfully. But they'll start from scratch and they'll rebuild. And they'll begin to investigate things with more maturity and honesty. They'll begin to consider evidence from all sides, arguments from all sides. And what they'll find is the Catholic Church is standing there with real answers to the real questions, real evidence for those seeking it. They'll find the Catholic Church there in the midst of that college campus. They'll find Dominicans there, for example, that can stand and argue with anyone. They'll find that the Catholic faith is perfectly suited for that environment and completely capable of overcoming every objection. Now, if they would have learned that faith from their childhood, they would have been prepared. But as I've said multiple times, they often learn an overly simplified, romanticized version that melts away under the heat of intelligent examination. And what they need is to learn the true Catholic faith, and hopefully they have the opportunity to do this when they're studying at these universities. Now, what's important is for parents to introduce their children to the resources that they're going to need to draw from when they come under that heat, when they come under that investigation, when they're asked for evidence, when they have to find answers for the questions that are presented to them. Their education, if it's a good education in preparing them for college, has to introduce them to the sources where they should seek those answers. Most Catholic education options don't do this. They simply teach the oversimplified view and then talk about how all the kids fall away. What we do, for example, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is introduce the kids to the greatest sources of the most subtle Catholic doctrine. We introduce them to the sacred scriptures. We introduce them to the Summa Theologica. We introduce them to the philosophy of Aristotle. We introduce them to the classical languages and to world history. We introduce them to classical philosophy. We don't expect them to have any mastery of these subjects, but we introduce them to these subjects and to the great works that form the sources of these subjects, and we make sure they're familiar with the content so they can use these resources when they leave us. And this is what these students are challenged to do. They're challenged to build a mature, tested Catholic faith that doesn't hide from the complexity and confusion and evil of the world, but considers the world as it is and seeks answers to it and finds those answers in the teaching of the sacred scriptures and of the Catholic Church, and builds a tested faith. That's the challenge of these great schools and universities. And many students fail in that environment. They fail. The weakness of their religion, their lack of grace, and so on, are exposed or revealed. And they fail. And it's their fault because there's no reason for them to fail. They are not persecuted. They are not threatened. They are not in any danger. They simply don't seek the answers. They simply wither and quit because of a lack of virtue, a lack of courage. The lack of virtue in them is exposed, virtue that should have been cultivated in them when they were younger in preparation for adult life. And so their weaknesses, their lack of virtue is exposed when they come under this pressure because they have no interest in defending their faith. And so they use their university education, they use their textbooks and their professors as excuses for their own shrinking back and walking away from Christianity. And their parents, embarrassed by this thought of their child no longer following their faith, they begin to blame others as well. They blame the schools, they blame the professors, they blame the government, they blame the culture, the media, and so on. But these things are not the causes of this falling away. These things have simply exposed the weakness of an individual student. Imagine if there was a city that was surrounded by walls and the gates on the city wall were not well maintained, and as the enemy approached, the enemy succeeded in breaking through one of the great gates and destroyed much of the city. The maintenance of the gates was the duty of the citizens and of the leaders of the city. The city was not prepared for battle. It was not prepared to keep the people safe. The maintenance work that was required was neglected, and when the enemy showed up, the enemy simply exposed the fault. It exposed the weakness. And so imagine the leaders of that city, after so many people were killed or kidnapped, whatever, looking at the people and saying, the enemy did this, rather than confessing that we failed to protect you because we didn't maintain and keep the gates strong. This is what Christians do when they talk about these modern colleges and institutions. These institutions don't have power to snuff out the Christian faith. They don't have arguments to defeat Christian truths. There's no information they share, there's no evidence they possess, there's no arguments they make that overcome the Christian faith. But what they do is expose students who imagine themselves to be something that they're not, or whose parents imagine them to be something that they're not. They expose the weakness. And the Christians blame the institutions rather than themselves, because, as Aristotle explains in Rhetoric, the truth is stronger than falsehood. If you possess the truth, you're not going to be overcome by an argument. And so when people are overcome, it's clear that they are not clinging to the truth. They're not holding fast, as sacred scripture would say. And the weakness of their education, the weakness of their culture, their lack of virtue, and so on, is exposed by the test of their faith. Now, when we look back in church history, we see that men professed the faith and maintained the faith in the face of horrific tortures. So it can never be true that an enemy has overcome the faith that dwells in a Christian or the truth that is known by a Christian. There's no way that that can be overcome. Christians have endured the most terrible tortures. The crucifixion is a model for us of the power of true faith, the power of God's grace at work in a human soul. Sin and unbelief, false teaching, all of the things that are present in modern secular society, none of them are capable of overcoming the Christian faith. But what they do is they expose weak Christians. And this is what leads to the response that we see in the modern media from Christians and conservatives, a blaming and criticizing of these colleges and schools rather than an acknowledgement that we're raising weak Christians. Weak Christians. That Christians are simply weak. They lack virtue. They're not reasonable. They're not courageous. When they're tested, they wither. They melt like wax in the heat. That's the problem. The problem is that the Christians are not strong enough. Many of these institutions were founded by Christians. They were founded on Christianity. The motto at Harvard on the seal or the logo of the university is Veritas, truth. And the conservative Americans will scoff at that. But Harvard was founded on an open American investigation of the truth, a pursuit of truth. But when that investigation is unleashed in a free society, any fake Christianity, any false teaching that's held as true teaching will be exposed. And that's what's happening to Christians. That's why they don't feel comfortable in these modern academic environments. That's why they fall away from the faith in these environments, if they even possess the faith in the first place. It's not the institutions, it's the weakness of the Christians. These institutions are free. Freedom of religion is maintained on these campuses, is taught on these campuses, is enforced on these campuses. That's why the pro-Palestinian Muslim groups were allowed to protest on Harvard campus, because religion is free. Speech is protected. That's, again, why these controversial protesters were allowed to stage their protest, because we recognize and maintain freedom of speech in America. In allowing those groups to gather and protest and speak, Harvard was practicing the principles that Americans claim to believe in. Harvard was practicing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, on and on. Harvard was modeling all of those American values, all of those American freedoms. Christians don't like those things. Christians, based on their reaction, would have liked if the university squashed the protests, or if the police would have suddenly rushed onto campus, rounded up all of the pro-Palestinian protesters and threw them all in the wagon and carried them off to jail. And yet those same Christians will turn around and then talk about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, and so on. They don't mean what they say. Harvard means what it says. But you've got to come to a campus like Harvard or any of the other great universities. You've got to come to that campus with evidence and reasons that are going to be able to stand against questions and apparently contradicting arguments and evidences. You've got to be strong enough to withstand those challenges and overcome them, if in fact you hold the true Christian faith. They're not going to accept some fake saint biography that neglects complicated, darker issues in the person's life to support your religion. They're not going to allow you to present a rosy-colored vision of the papacy or the Catholic Church in history that's purged of all talk of confusion and scandals and schisms and so on. They're not going to let you write the textbooks with no evidence. They're not going to let you control the narrative. They're not going to let you silence anyone who speaks against you. They're not going to let you dodge all of the questions that you don't have answers for. And this is what Christians don't like in modern society. They don't want to have to give an account. Many Christian families live a very comfortable, isolated life in suburban communities where they just sort of wall themselves in this little snow globe of life. Mommy and the children stay at home. Daddy goes off to work. All of the stuff of the workplace is kept away, and the children are raised in a snow globe on fictional stories and fantasies that present a world and present a religion and present a God and a church and saints that really are not what they are. Now, we don't find this in the Bible. When we take up the Bible and read it, we don't find this overly simplified religion. We don't find this romanticized religion in the Bible. And so what Christian parents are doing is not what God himself has done in giving us the Scriptures. We don't find this message, this VeggieTales message, and I'm just using VeggieTales as an example of this child-friendly Christianity that's created. There are many other stories like this. Saturday mornings on EWTN, you've got Catholic cartoons and all kinds of stuff. This isn't in the Scriptures. This isn't in the Gospels. Jesus didn't talk with any rose-colored glasses, or ask people to look through rose-colored glasses. He didn't make any promises of comfort and convenience when he talked to people. He told people very plainly up front that they would need to sacrifice everything for his sake, that anyone who is ashamed of him, he himself would deny before the Father. We read in the Scriptures of a crucified Savior who's the model of the Christian life. We go on to the book of Acts and read about persecuted, eventually murdered apostles and other Christians. That's the religion that the Bible teaches us. In the Old Testament, we read about murders, rapes, all kinds of crimes and evils. The Holy Spirit doesn't hold any of the ugliness back. God presents us with the truth, a complicated, subtle religion that's very difficult to learn, very difficult to understand, very difficult to practice, very difficult to explain, because that's the truth. It's complicated. It's ugly. It's embarrassing. We're the ones who think to make up this child-friendly religion that doesn't prepare our children for real life. In the Old Testament, God says in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he says that the Scriptures, the law that he's given us, the words that he's given us, they are to be our constant conversation. We're to talk about them with our children all day, every day. When we rise up, when we go about our business, when we lie down at night, we're supposed to be talking about the Scriptures with our children constantly. These dirty, messy, complicated stories in the Bible are supposed to be our constant conversation because it's going to prepare us for real life. The book of Proverbs opens with its purpose stated in the opening lines, and it says that its purpose is to give subtlety to the simple. To give subtlety to the simple. I'll read it real quick. The very opening lines of the book of Proverbs. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand the words of prudence, to receive the instruction of doctrine, justice and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to little ones. To the young man, knowledge and understanding. A wise man shall hear and shall be wiser. This is the purpose of the book of Proverbs. How many Catholic children are being taught the book of Proverbs, which was given to us by God to give subtlety to little ones? These things aren't taught to children because the children are learning cartoon versions of saint stories instead. They're not being prepared for reality. And this is what's exposed by these modern universities, modern institutions, and so on. This child-friendly Christianity that never grows up, that never addresses reality, is what's exposed and torn apart by good universities. And so the response, like I said before, the response is to withdraw and withdraw and withdraw and hide from these things. Not acknowledge the problem, not come up with a solution, not do better, but simply retreat and retreat and retreat and make up a victim story about how these institutions are too powerful for Christians to handle, which is false. But this is why Christians don't like these institutions. They've been lazy and neglectful in their Christian studies. They lack virtue. They don't practice the faith in a sustainable way. And when they enter into any environment that doesn't support the Christian faith, they can't stand on their own 2 feet. And so they label that institution as evil, when in fact that institution is normal. And they're simply too weak to function in a normal adult environment, a free environment. And this is what we face in modern America. Now, this trickles back to education, where those excuses now enter the high school classroom, and the kids are taught, we don't care about selective universities. We don't care about the great colleges. We don't want to go to those liberal schools because they teach all kinds of foolishness. The truth is, they don't teach foolishness. The truth is, they ask questions that Christians aren't prepared to answer. They present evidence that makes the simple Bible stories, the overly simplified stories, not true Bible stories, they make them appear to be contradictory. And so the modern Christians don't want to deal with those things. They want to stay in the snow globe. And so now in the high schools, we've got children being told that they should avoid those great schools, avoid those great institutions, and seek out inferior institutions that are within the snow globe, so they're not challenged. The religion that they've been taught is not questioned. No contradictory opinions or evidence is allowed to be presented to them. It's like the Truman Show, if you've watched that movie. They're kept inside the set. And so they're sent to private Catholic colleges that teach what they learned as children and enforce this romanticized view of Christianity. And it only delays the problem. It only pushes back the consequences of this problem, because eventually the kids graduate, and then what? What do they do when they graduate? We see them struggle because there's no way to hide anymore. They enter into the adult life and there's no way to hide. Those kids don't become religious. They don't become religious because the actual life of religious vocations doesn't fit the story that they were taught growing up. It doesn't fit the nice, friendly, romanticized, overly simplified Catholicism that they were taught. They don't go on to seminary. They don't go on to monasteries or convents. They go into the world, a world that they are not prepared for, and they struggle to do anything. They struggle to do anything. And those of them who do well in the world would have done well at one of these great colleges as well. And they would have had many more opportunities, many more resources, many more connections, many, many benefits that they've now lost. And those are the strong ones. But most of them graduate and they just sort of float on the surface of American culture until they have children, and then they sort of enter back into that childish religion. And as long as they can continue entering back into that childish religion, which is why they spend so much time talking about raising children and family life and education, and by education they mean elementary education. The reason why they talk about that so much and put so much emphasis on that is because it's the only place they feel comfortable. And rather than acknowledging that this is a problem, they pretend that this is because they're faithful and all of those other things are bad. So this gets into the high schools, and the standards of the high schools drops because there's no pressure to get admitted into any of these private Catholic schools. They admit almost everyone who applies. There's no pressure for admission. There's no standards. And that message trickles down into the high school and lowers standards. The low standards in the high school trickle down into the middle school. All the standards drop, trickles back down into the elementary school. Standards and objectives drop. And this is why we see this degenerate modern Christian educational culture. Because there's no goal. There's no challenge. There's no outside standard to try and achieve and work up to, because we've just said that the high standards of past generation, those institutions are just all stupid. They're all liberal. They're all stupid. They're all a waste of time, a waste of money, and so on. We see Catholic schools even creating their own accreditation agencies so that they can accredit themselves. They accredit themselves because they don't want to deal with external accreditation standards that all other schools are subjected to, voluntarily subject themselves to. They don't want to subject themselves to those standards. They just say they're stupid. And it's not that they oppose accreditation or say accreditation is not necessary. They make up their own accreditation and pretend to be accredited by accrediting themselves. And the parents don't know any better. I can't believe they fall for that, but the schools just accredit themselves with small private accreditation organizations that mean nothing. They don't even meet the qualifications of an accreditation agency. They're not recognized by the U.S. Department of Education, which is what it means to be accredited. And there's lots of reasons for that, which again, they just say, oh, that's all stupid. It's not all stupid. Accreditation is not necessary. That's true. You wouldn't need accreditation if you had fruits that manifested your extraordinary achievements, but you don't. And therefore, accreditation becomes a source of verification that you actually are working behind the scenes to provide students with a good education. That's what the accrediting agents look for. They look to see that the teachers and the faculty, the administrators are working for the benefit of the children. That's what accreditation is about. So you see how this scoffing at the highest and greatest institutions trickles down into the lower levels of Christian society and destroys all standards of learning, of culture, and so on. Christians retreat and retreat and retreat and pretend that their retreating is a sign of their faithfulness, whereas it's just surrendering, because Jesus tells us to go into the world and make disciples. The retreating Christianity is not fulfilling the Great Commission. Strong Christians can go to the greatest universities and stand on campus and lead others to the faith. They can go into the world and make disciples, and by doing so, at the most selective and prestigious institutions, They can influence people who are going to go into society as leaders and influential people and influence many indirectly through others. But this is the problem with modern Catholic society. It's been exacerbated by the whole Trump culture, because Trump is sort of the model of this culture. Just call everything stupid and make yourself the only standard, the only thing good, the only thing right, and call everything else stupid. That's Trump is the personification of that spirit, of that whole message. And that's why we see 70 million Americans voting for Trump. He represents their worldview. He represents their worldview. And anyone outside of that worldview is just stupid, a liar, a fraud, ignorant, irrational, crazy. It just goes on and on. The institutions are all liberal, foolish, corrupt, and so on. There's no evidence of any of these things, and there are faithful Catholics at all of these institutions, leading these institutions, teaching at these institutions, studying at these institutions, ministering at these institutions. And yet these Christian people talk about these institutions with no knowledge of what's going on there to excuse their own neglect of the real responsibilities of the Christian life. So be assured, I can tell you from experience that what is said in conservative circles or in Christian circles about great universities and schools is not true. It's not true at all. It's challenging for sure, because your faith is things that you say are going to be challenged by people who don't agree with you. But those challenges force you to examine yourself, to examine what you think is true. And sometimes you learn that the reason you're struggling is because what you think actually is not true, and you've got to dig and find the truth, and you become stronger. So hopefully, Christians will eventually stop scoffing at the institutions that they should actually be working to gain admission to and influence at, rather than retreating and pretending that hiding and running away is a sign of strength.